Thank you so much for submitting your questions and watching and joining us for this World Day Against Trafficking panel. We covered so much with Melanie Thompson and Cristian Eduardo that we actually broke the video into 4 parts, which we are going to be sharing all weekend. So part 2 will be airing tomorrow and part 1 starts now.
Before we start the panel, we just want to bring attention to the fact that we will be discussing some difficult and possibly triggering subjects. Our goal here is to have an honest, thoughtful, and informative, worthwhile conversation. So, without further ado, let's get this panel started.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our World Day Against Trafficking panel. I'm Laura Morano.
And I'm Vanessa Morano. So the goal today is to have a conversation. And it's going to be a conversation about a topic that is not often discussed. As some of you know, our film Saving Zoe touched upon issues of online sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And we really wanted to do this panel in order to have an honest and hopefully enlightening conversation that is first and foremost survivor informed.
So with that said, we are so thrilled and so grateful to have survivors and advocates, Melanie Thompson and Cristian Eduardo, joining us in this panel. Thank you guys so much for being here.
No, thank you for having us.
Oh, I know. I love we're also doing this virtually. We were just speaking beforehand about how fun virtual stuff is. I have to also say we had a bunch of questions come in. We asked you guys to submit questions, and I have to say Vanessa and I were blown away by the questions. To be completely honest and transparent, I was kind of expecting questions that were going to be off topic and not super informed, and I was pleasantly shocked to find questions that were both thought-provoking and thoughtful. So thank you guys so much for sending in those questions.
For sure. So, diving right in, something that I want to start with first is just human trafficking as a whole and how it is defined internationally. So human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a person by means of threat, use of force, or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation.
So there's a lot of things that fall under this umbrella, and something that we all spoke about is making sure that we really were specific on what we were talking about, but kind of talking about some of the forms that fall under human trafficking. It's forced labor and services, slavery or other practices that are similar to slavery, servitude, the removal of organs, and again, of course, the topic that we are focusing on today, which is the exploitation of prostitution of others and other forms of sexual exploitation.
Now, what many people don't realize about sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, and this is something that we learned through the process of making Saving Zoe and marketing it, is that sex trafficking and sexual exploitation is an industry that's worth billions and billions of dollars. According to the United Nations International Labor Organization, an estimate of $99 billion is made from commercial sexual exploitation every year. And the United States is one of the top countries where sex trafficking occurs, not just of foreign nationals, but also of US citizens.
So Melanie and Cristian, we want to turn it over to you guys. And if it's okay, Melanie, we'd love to start with you. As a survivor and as an advocate, would you mind sharing a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you guys for having me. So I was trafficked here in New York when I was 12 years old. This is my hometown. And I was trafficked as a child and then remained in prostitution on and off through my adulthood. I actually got into advocacy when I was 14. I was very young. I was arrested, so I did end up in the juvenile justice system. And when I was in, one of those facilities, there was a famous New York Times reporter who came and wanted to interview the director of that program. And the director said, well, why don't you speak to one of the youth here? And they ended up interviewing me. And it was a really small column in the New York Times. But when it came out, that was kind of like my aha moment, because I realized that there were so many times when I was in prostitution that I could have died and I didn't. And then seeing this little line column on the side of the newspaper, it was just like, hey, Melanie, you could use your voice and reach so many people. So I started doing small interviews. And then eventually when I left the juvenile justice system, I ended up doing larger interviews and more interviews. And then people kept asking me. And then I was like, this is my life's work. I found myself at dinner tables with friends and going out trying to like educate people when they said something wrong. So I was just like, this has to be what it is. So now here I am 10 years later, still doing work.
And by the way, you're amazing at it. We met Melanie at the UN when we took Saving Zoe there to show a clip. And Melanie, you spoke so eloquently and so articulately. And it was just such a pleasure just to be in your presence and hear you speak. And I'm so grateful that you speak about this issue, because really it's wonderful to hear your point of view on it and the ways that we can rectify it. Cristian, we'd love to hear about your journey.
Yeah, sure. I'm so happy that we are doing actually this thing and we're having this conversation, because this means a lot for me. I think so that through this conversation, we're going to break like so many myths and so many like stereotypes that we have around like what is trafficking and prostitution. So my name is Cristian Eduardo. I am a survivor of international and domestic sex and labor trafficking. I was trafficked as a young adult. I was trafficked also being because I identify as a male, as a man, because I think so that sometimes we think that this cannot happen to boys, to men, to young adults, but I want to repeat again that I was trafficked being a young adult, and I was trafficking me identifying myself as a male. So I think so this is super important, because sometimes we think that this only happens especially to kids, and no, I want to highlight that this can happen to everyone. Like the human trafficking feeds upon the vulnerabilities of people, the vulnerabilities of individuals, the vulnerabilities of communities. So every barrier is an opportunity for a trafficker. Every barrier is an opportunity for a perpetrator. So we never need to lose that and keep that in mind. So I start advocating because actually I started hearing about this kind of romanticizing prostitution, and because I identify as part of the LGBT community, this was a shock for me because I was really worried, because I have been an advocate for the immigrants and the LGBT rights, and I don't want someone else being trafficked, especially for my community. So when I start hearing all these things about romanticizing prostitution, that it was empowering, all these things, I was like, okay, I think so that this happened. Even also to me, when I was being trafficked, I thought that I was the one to blame, but we need to remember that there are people who are preying upon the vulnerable communities. And I don't want to any other human being being in hell like me. So that's why I started speaking out about and educating around what is human trafficking, and that we are all vulnerable.
For sure. And every point you just brought up is something that we are going to touch upon in this conversation. One in particular, we actually got a question online from Megan. She's from New Jersey. And she wrote saying, I think a preconceived notion that I had about sex trafficking / human trafficking is that it only focused on a certain age group. Were you aware or surprised yourselves that it could literally happen to anyone at any age? And obviously you experienced this firsthand, Cristian. Did you have any preconceived notions about that it only happened to children? Like, what was the realization process that it can happen to you as an adult?
You know that actually after I escaped my trafficking situation, I didn't understand what was happening in my life. I was like, there's something wrong. I know that I was doing things that I wasn't comfortable with. I know that I didn't have any choice. I know that I was trying to survive. I know all these things that it's in your mind, because I think so that part of your body is like telling you, it's protecting you. It's like, okay, everything is going to be okay. You need to go forward. So, and it's interesting because I think so that Hollywood, the movies, like everywhere, all media, like it's always telling us like, oh, human trafficking is happening with kids, like kids being kidnapped, moving to other countries. And we never talk about like young adults, like people, seniors, like literally everybody can be trafficked. Every single person out there who encounters someone who has a differential in power and control. And these people are really good. These people are really good at, you can have all your needs covered, but they just need one opportunity to prey upon you, and to, you know what, and I think so that sometimes we don't talk about the grooming process. That is something so important. But coming back to your question, actually, I never thought that I was trafficked.
Mm.
It was so, when I start to getting like legal help and all those things, and I start to see like the elements, and I start to educate myself, like, because from to people who are survivors of human trafficking here, and if you are an immigrant, you qualify for legal relief. So the lawyer explained you a little bit about what is going to be the process, and in that process, I started to realize that, so I'm a victim of human trafficking. And my first reaction was that it was my fault, and I was like, oh my god, like, I cannot believe that this happened to me, especially because I was an adult, and I was like, what am I supposed to protect myself, to be able, like, to make choices, like to understand what is happening. But to be honest, I was so vulnerable that I couldn't realize that. And during the process, I realized that I was trafficked twice, like not only on domestically, but also internationally. So I think so that we need to really talk about this with our community, with our kids, in our families, in our school, like everywhere for real, because literally everywhere, especially here in the United States, that is a country full of immigrants and where people are from different parts of the world, like we are all like, we can all be praised of traffickers.
I think what you just said about not realizing that you were trafficked, we spoke to many survivors through our process of making Saving Zoe and marketing Saving Zoe. And we heard that from a few people that they didn't realize it happened to them. And I think a huge part of that has to do with how we think about human trafficking and sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. You know, in media, like Taken, for example, right? The protagonist is taken from her vacation rental after meeting someone in the airport. You know, we think about kidnapping, being stolen from your home or plucked off the street in like a white van. This is what we often envision that the scenario of sex trafficking looks like and how it occurs. But most of the time, that isn't how it occurs. We've talked about this many times. Like, that can happen, but it's far more insidious in how trafficking and exploitation does occur. Can you both speak to, in your experience, some stories or some ways in which trafficking has occurred?
So, more to your point, right? I think that this also kind of ties into your last question as well, but I think that when people think of trafficking or hear trafficking, they automatically think taken. If they don't do this work and talk about this all the time, that's the only representation that they have in the media. Otherwise, it's movies that are displaying prostitution in a glamorized fashion. So it's either you have like, it's either you, I don't remember the movie with Julia Roberts. What is
Pretty Woman.
So it's either you have Pretty Woman or you have Taken to show the scale of what exploitation looks like. And for me, one, I didn't know either what was happening, because all I knew that I was taken, like physically, but I didn't know that there was a term and a definition for it. And I think many people don't, because of what is displayed. But in reality, especially in the US, and I think that needs to be emphasized, because a lot of people still think trafficking and exploitation only happens in India and China and France. And honestly, here in the US, because we're made of 50 states that are all very city-like, urban, and modernized, you have prostitution and exploitation adapts to that environment. So because it's illegal here and there are no red light districts in these modern cities, you're not going to see prostitution on the street the way that you would in a red light district in India. So here, at least in my case, it started as street walking. So they did have those tracks or those roads, but then it transitioned online. And it was the online piece that really gave prostitution its anonymity. And I think that insidiousness, I mean, it comes throughout all forms of exploitation on the street and strip clubs, whatever have you. But because the internet made it so easy for perpetrators to hide their identity, as well as while simultaneously increasing the amount of people that can go anonymous and purchase somebody for sexual access, it made it such an enterprise. So where we now have over $38 billion a year in the sex trade. So I think that the insidiousness comes from the ways that it has innovated itself over the years.
Yes, it's true. And also, I also think that we don't understand what is psychological coercion, because most of the time we are being trafficked by our partners, by boyfriends, by our girlfriends, by people who is giving you a hand, you know, because that is the huge problem, that traffickers and perpetrators, they are looking how to catch you. They are looking how to approach you. They are looking how to bond with you. In my case, I arrived here and I was diagnosed HIV positive, and I didn't know about the laws here and all these things. So I had a lot of needs, like housing, food, like this feeling of safety. So, and I think so that it's another of the myths of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, that it's an exchange between like the access to someone's body and money, but not always is this part the money. A lot of times this part, it can be like a place to stay or a place to sleep, or a place to take a shower, a plate of food, a glass of water, like for real, literally every single basic, super basic need that we have. A lot of people, even right now, they don't have it. People are preying upon that. So I think so that psychological coercion, trauma bond were two of the main components when I was trafficked. And this is not explained in movies. This is not explained when we talk about human trafficking. This is not explained when we are like trying to educate, like what is happening. And I think so that is why we are, as individuals, as a society, as a communities, we are not able to identify like the red flags about human and sex trafficking, because sometimes it's like, but you know, we never thought about the parents who are trafficking their kids. We never thought about the boyfriends who are trafficking their boyfriends, the boyfriends who are trafficking their girlfriends. Like we never thought about it. We never talked about the teachers who are trafficking their students, the boss who are trafficking like, the employers. That sex trafficking and human trafficking, it's so wide, and I think so that it's so, as you said, so insidious, like so silent, that a lot of people are like, I don't know what happened to me. I just needed to survive. I just needed to get money. I just needed to get food. I just needed to escape. I just needed a hug. And I think so that we fail to understand that, and that is huge. And I really need to people to think about this, like, because sometimes this can happen to us, but I think so that it's important to talk about this, like to stop it and to identify if someone that you know is vulnerable, you know, and approach them and support them, because I think so that if we really want to fight against trafficking, we need to start worrying one each other.
And I think another answer to this question of how it's so insidious is the fact that many people don't understand what the grooming process looks like. Mm-hmm. Because when they hear trafficking, they think snatched up and then automatically put into a negative situation, where a lot of times that psychological coercion and that fraud comes from building a relationship over time. It doesn't have to be an intimate relationship, but building the perpetrators are working on your mind for a longer period of time before they go ahead and, you know, for lack of a better term, snatch you up, right? Like it does happen it does happen that way sometimes, but especially out here when you're trying to, where it's illegal and you're trying to get the person to get onto your side willingly, you have to groom them, and that usually takes a couple of months. So a lot of people don't take that into account when they hear trafficking stories. They just think about like the signs on the highway that's like missing person, Amber Alert, you know, what is the license plate of this car? But they're not understanding that some people, these could be people you absolutely don't know, but these could also be friends, family, partners that are working on your mind, making you trust them first, and then going in and putting you into exploitation. So I think that that gets lost in translation, and that's why it's so insidious, because you can easily go from a partner to a trafficker in a 2.5 seconds.
Oh, totally. And we do want to tap into the grooming process, but I also think one thing that a lot of people think as well when they're thinking about trafficking is that transportation has to be involved.
Right.
So, which is kind of an interesting thing, and I think we have an opportunity to break the myth. A question that we got actually from someone in the UK, Demi, she asked, you know, is human trafficking a crime that must involve some form of travel, transportation, or movement across state or national borders? And I thought that was actually a really great question to have, because again, via the movie Taken, via all these different things, I think the expectation and the perception is trafficking, you have to be, you have to travel. And sometimes that is definitely the case, but that isn't always the case, correct?
Absolutely. And I think that's also one of my favorite questions to be asked, because a lot of people, like Vanessa read that definition in the beginning, they kind of stop at force, fraud, coercion, and then they hear transportation. There's a part in that definition that talks about the abuse of power or vulnerability. And that is what majority of domestic trafficking cases look like. Yes, you can come from other states. Yes, people can take you out the country. That becomes international trafficking. But sometimes, like in my case, when I first got into the life, as I call it, it was here, New York based, and I was sexually exploited. But because he was abusing my power and targeting my vulnerability, now I fall under this human trafficking umbrella. Eventually, I ended up moving across state lines, but that didn't matter because of that part of the definition that so many people tend to overlook.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I mean, I think we touched upon this, and we'll touch on it a bit more in the conversation, but you know, as the internet becomes more and more prevalent in our lives, it becomes so much more easier for a perpetrator to target someone and for them to get comfortable with someone and for you to trust someone who you are meeting online, which feeds into the grooming process.
Also that it's easier to target people near to you now with internet, you know, because I think so that also in the definition, it always like it mentioned transportation, because I think so that before it was so hard, right? Like okay, I cannot target someone from my community because everybody knows these people, and I think so that we right now we are so disconnected inside our communities. We don't know one each other, but I think so that traffickers are using that, like, you know what? Because we don't know who is living on my next door one corner, like we don't know one each other, and traffickers can target that, you know that. And I think so that also that internet, it makes so easy, because on Facebook we post like, oh, I'm feeling alone, I'm going alone, I'm doing all these things. So we are always highlighting all our vulnerabilities, you know, and it's like, it's so easy, I think so, that for perpetrators to come and say like, oh, but you look beautiful. And of course, if you have been posted things that, oh, I don't feel beautiful, nobody like me and all this thing, and somebody suddenly came, that person is going to use their power and control over you, because they know your vulnerability and they are exploiting you. And I think so that also sometimes we don't realize about all these things, like how social media, internet can be so damaging for us.
Yes, 100%, and feeds into the grooming process, which is, I feel like people are watching, they're hearing this, they're like, what is this grooming process? And so I think this is a perfect opportunity to like, let's dive deep. Predators, when they're targeting potential victims, they go into this process called grooming. So could you guys explain and kind of break down the grooming process a little bit?
I was waiting for Cristian.
Oh, I was waiting also.
No, so the way that I usually describe the grooming process, because it's so multifaceted. However, the easiest visual that I can create is similar to the power and control wheel. So a lot of people have the misconception that traffickers are always an intimate partner, and that's not necessarily the case. But it usually starts by getting you to trust them in some type of way, if this is somebody that you're familiar with. In my case, my trafficker was a stranger to me. However, even in the stranger situation, you still have to build this bond. So that comes from giving you compliments, making promises, Well, this is one form of it. You can make promises, you can give compliments, you can make them feel secure, you can make them feel like you love them, you can get into a relationship with them for however many so months or amount of time. Another way that they can start the grooming process, in my case, because he was a stranger to me, was through threats and intimidation. And what that does is keep that psychological coercion. So on one hand, you can have a trafficker who is trying to go the love route, or the romantic pimp, as they call it, and try to butter you up and make you feel special. And like Cristian was mentioning, preying on those vulnerabilities. If you say you're lonely, if you say you're hungry, if you say, you know, I don't have a place to sleep, I come in and provide you with all those things and make you feel safe. On the other hand, through threats and intimidation is, you're going to do what I say. I know where your sister lives. I know where your mother lives. You're going to do this. You show pictures of the family. In my case, they took away everything I had. So my cell phone, my school ID, anything that could identify me. You use weapons. You have other, like you have, in terms of intimidation, you have other people, like they'll set up people to like beat you up or threaten to hit you or things like that. So there are many ways to groom somebody, but really overall in general, what the grooming process is a process that traffickers use to keep you mentally confined to comply with what they're asking for. So of course, in the initial stages, nobody, for the most part, I would say the majority of people don't want to wake up and just go straight into prostitution or trafficking or exploitation. So they expect that in the beginning stages, that first time, you're going to put up a fight, or you're going to try to disobey, or you're going to try to do things that are unappealing to them. So in order to get you there, it's either you make them feel loved and make them feel like you are going to be their number one supporter, or you threaten them and make them feel like they're worthless so that they feel like they're confined and have to stay there and obligated to do that. So that process can take anywhere from 1 day to 3 weeks to years. I know I have a survivor sister of mine who was in a relationship with a man for 3 years before he became her trafficker. And by that time, he has all of her personal information, knows where her mother lives. And he said, well, you're going to do this for me, because if it's not going to be you, it's going to be your mom. So there are many different ways that they can approach grooming, but overall, the grooming process is still, the goal of grooming is still the same. It's to get you to make you feel mentally confined and obligated to oblige and obey.
Yes, it is so true. And I really like how Melanie described it. And I'm going to use myself as an example. I think so that I feel, and I explain grooming as when they condition you, because they make you feel conditioned. They make you feel that you own them something. Mm-hmm. And it can be money, feelings, like whatever, like literally whatever. In my case, I was vulnerable because I didn't know the laws here. I was just diagnosed HIV positive. I wasn't open about being a gay man. So, and they were from Mexico, from the same country that I am from. So all these components were over there. So it was, I think so, I say it was easy for them because, to be honest, all abusers, all perpetrators, all traffickers, they know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. It's not just that they are like, oh, I was trying to help somebody. No, they are super intelligent, super like for real. Like they get things like this person is this, and I'm going to approach. And they have different tactics. As Melanie say, it can be like the full of love and all this thing. And if it doesn't work, go to the other part of the spectrum, like violence, like threats and all these things. So for me, it was like, oh, you're alone. You're not going to be alone. You know, you're going to have a place to sleep, to eat. But at the same time, while they are providing you with all these things that you need, and you don't have a support system, you don't have any organization, nobody, no friends, no family who can like help you, who is listening to you, who is like identifying the red flags. So you start walking that path. And the thing is that suddenly things start like, oh, but you are not working, or you are not paying the rent, or mm-hmm. you are eating 3 times a day, you know, or things like that. Things like, oh, you know, like, why don't you give me a hug? It can be like, you know, to start breaking your boundaries and like to start normalizing your exploitation, because they are conditioning you. So they are giving you things, but they make sure that you understand that it's not for free. So silently, they are putting you on that way. And until you realize that to be honest, that you are being sexually exploited, and that is happening. Like when you are being trafficked, you are being raped, you are being sexually harassed, you are being sexually exploited, and this can go like 24/7. And now it becomes now not because of gifts, not because of they are helping you. Now it's a must because you accept in the beginning. When do you accept? When you receive the things. You don't need to say yes, but when you receive the things, you for them is like you agree on this. Mm-hmm. Remember, like you accept to come here, you accept my food, you accept my clothes, you accept my love, my hugs, my company. So you are conditioned, and so when you are there, it's like, what other choice do I have? Am I alone? I don't know what is happening. And also, like, you are experiencing already the trauma of being like sexually harassed, rape, like the psychological coercion, and all these components. And this is happening at the same time. So, and now traffickers, now that they know that they have you in their hands, now they start to playing with you, like with threats, violence, like, oh, nobody's going to look for you, nobody's going to accept you, like you are alive because of me, like they can be violent, like they can yell at you, like you can experience like in certain level like domestic violence, because remember that they bond with you. So all these components are there, they are bonding with you, and they need to make sure that they are breaking your will, that you don't want to fight, that you don't want to pose them. So what? So they can continue exploiting you. And this can take several paths. They can continue, like traffickers can continue sexual exploiting you, and they can start like, oh, you know what? I have friends who want to come here. Let's drink alcohol. So let's have a party and all this thing. Or just suddenly like take you like, a friend is going to come and I don't have money to pay the rent. So you are going to have sex with this person and all this. There are so different paths. But it's what we were saying. It's so insidious that, to be honest, I didn't realize what was happening. I never thought, I never discovered. I was so worried about my future and about like what was happening to me, why I was having nightmare, trouble to sleep, anxiety, and all these things, that my body was so disconnected that I wasn't able like to connect all the dots. Like, oh, something is happening and it's not your fault. So that is the grooming process, and this can happen to anyone. And sometimes, most of the time, we say vulnerabilities, but this can happen also like with a student and teacher. What if the teacher is like, oh, you know what? I can give you all the opportunities of the world. I know all the people, all the important people, like, but you know what? I need something in exchange. And when access of body, it's something in exchange, that is trafficking, that is exploitation. This can happen in the workplace. This can happen literally everywhere.
We're going to end here now. Thank you so much for watching part 1. Part 2 will be posted tomorrow.